Good afternoon, everyone. I pray that your Monday, your Memorial Day, you found spaces and places of laughter, of joy, of peace, that maybe you ate your first piece of barbecue or something that you put on the grill. I just pray that there was times during the day where it felt good. And I know for some it was a time of remembering those who had gone before us. So the whole day may not have been as upbeat, but sometimes even remembering is good. I want to continue in our talks about fears. And this time I want to talk about fear of yourself, fear of your emotions. For a number of us, we worked really hard in not allowing our emotions to come to surface because we were afraid of what that may look like. We were afraid that if we allowed the feelings that had been harboring deep inside of us, if we allowed them to come to the surface, that it might be overwhelming, that we may not be able to manage it, that we may find ourselves looking silly or just creating more problems or havoc. Let me explain. Most of you know I did a lot of work with combat veterans, and a lot of times I would hear these, particularly men who had served in campaigns, who had been shot at, who had shot at others, who had been involved in skirmishes, who were able to make it home safely, who had determined that at the time when they experienced their first combat trauma, that unconsciously they made the decision not to feel. Because if they allowed themselves to feel, they probably would not have come home alive. They probably would have gotten overwhelmed with the feelings and would not have been able to do what the mission required. So as a result, when they came home, they still kept their feelings bottled up inside. And a lot of them would tell me that their wives or their partners would say to them, "You don't have any feelings. You're dead inside. You just don't have any feelings." And so one of the things when I would ask them, "Is that true?" they would say, "I guess not." But as we began to explore, they began to share about if they allowed themselves to really feel, their fear is that it would be overwhelming, that it would be all consuming, that they might not be able to control it. Let me tell you, I have been blessed to have many a very grown man who is quite competent, who would dissolve into tears in my office, who would curse me out. One would say to me, "Lady, every time I come in here, I cry." But little did they know that each time they allowed themselves to feel, their healing was taking place. Each time they allowed themselves to feel, even though it felt foreign to them, that there was something that was happening, that they were allowing themselves to grow, to recover, to come to a place of restoration and balance. This morning when I was taking my walk and I thought about how I would frame this, I decided I would share 3 instances in my life when I gave myself permission to feel. And it's interesting that I only really came up with 3 because it makes me have to own that I've worked really, really hard based on my history to not let people see my feelings, to not let my feelings show. And so the first instance, which I will just touch on lightly because it's in my book, and you are more than welcome to purchase my book, which is on Amazon. It's called The First Time, because everything has a beginning. And if you don't remember any of that, just Google my name on Amazon, Carolyn Harris-Hutchinson, and you'll see a picture of me as a little girl. But I digress. In the book, I talk about when I came to the realization, or when my sponsor in the 12-step program asked me a very significant question regarding my mother. And she said to me, just suppose your mother really doesn't like you. And that had been something I had been thinking, something I had been fighting against, but no one had ever posed it to me. She said, just suppose that was true. And let me tell you, as I stated in the book, I began to cry. And I remember I was laying in the bed on the phone and I began to cry, and it felt like I cried for hours when it probably wasn't that long. But I cried and cried and cried and cried and cried. And this is significant because as I look back, this may have been one of the very few times in my life, if not the first time, that I allowed myself to display my feelings and have someone else witness it, albeit she was on the phone. And believe it or not, after I had cried myself till I was exhausted, I actually felt better. I actually felt better, and it opened up a path for me to begin to look at my interactions with not just my mom, but with other people in a very different way. The second instance I want to talk about, which I tend not to talk about, but is when I was going through my divorce. And I had joined an organization called Divorce Care, and I will put a link in the description that was really, really helpful for me. But each time I would come, the other people in the group, they would cry, they would, do whatever they do. They would show their emotions. And I was kind of matter of fact. And I kind of felt like I had already dealt with my emotions. I had dealt with them before I had accepted that the marriage was over. I had dealt with all that stuff before. This was just making sure that I had I dotted all my I's and crossed all my T's and went through the checklist, because I was a therapist and I knew you had to go through some things. You needed a place to share, so I was going to do the sharing. But I was doing it from a very logical perspective and not necessarily a very feeling or emotional perspective. But one day I was coming back to work and I was talking to a good friend on the phone. And I don't remember what she said to me or whatever or what had happened, but I began to cry. And she said to me while I was driving, and she said to me, you should probably just go home. Don't go back to work. And so I did. And I'm noticing a lot of my times of being emotionally open has been on the phone when the person's not present. But anyway, so I went home, and at night was my meeting for Divorce Care. And so I got myself together and I went, and when I walked in, we would normally go around the table and say how we were doing. And when I opened my mouth to say how I was doing, I began to cry. And I don't believe I ever got any words out. They just went right by me, gave me space to cry, and I cried for the entire hour and a half. And again, when that was over, I was exhausted. I was spent, but I felt some degree of relief. I felt like a weight had been lifted off of me. I felt like there was finally some light that was coming into what had been previously a very dark space. The third story I'm going to share very quickly, as you all know if you read the book, again, I mentioned the book. My mom and I did not have the best relationship. Being a mother was not necessarily what she was called to be. But as we both grew older, as I began to heal, as she began her own healing process, our relationship did improve. So at the time that when she, around the time when she transitioned, she had been living in a nursing home in New York, and I live in Maryland. And so to make a long story very short, I went up there because she had been placed in the hospital. I was able to see her. She was not able to speak to me, and a couple of hours later, she died. And I immediately went into logical mode. I had already located a crematorium. to cremate her. I made plans to go to, I immediately went to the nursing home to, clear out her stuff and to get the account in order. I went into logical mode. And when I came home, I stayed in logical mode. I began to think about, okay, so how can we honor her, because she was not a church going woman. That would not have been something that she would have liked. I was trying to figure out what to do, and one of my cousins said, well, let's just have a gathering here at my house and we will celebrate her in a way that would have been honoring for her. And I agreed. And trust me, through all of this, I kind of just was going through logical mode, holding myself together. But as we gathered at my cousin's house, I remember sitting on the back deck, and as I watched people begin to come in, it began to hit me how loved my mother had been. And I began to become overwhelmed with emotion, and I began to cry. And I sat on that deck. I was surrounded by loved ones, and I overheard a younger cousin say, I don't know what to do. I've never seen Carolyn cry. And I cried and I cried and I cried. And guess what? Again, at the end, I felt better. So my invitation to you, my beloved, is for those who have not allowed ourselves to feel, because we feel like we're going to be overwhelmed, like those feelings are going to consume us. They just might. But there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There is something waiting at the end that you can't imagine. There's something called a sense of release, a sense of peace, a sense of a weight being lifted. And that's what I want for each and every one of you. So I invite you today to give yourself permission to continue your journaling. Let those feelings out. Because while it may feel overwhelming, you won't die. You won't die. What you will do is be able to live on purpose. Love you, and we'll talk with you tomorrow. Bye-bye.